Thank you, Mr. President. To the distinguished President of the United Nations Human Rights Council, Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be a part of this biennial high-level panel discussion on the question of the death penalty, particularly with its team contribution of the judiciary to the advancement of human rights and the question of the death penalty. In 2023, Malaysia witnessed a historic development in its criminal justice system, where on the 3rd and 11th of April 2023, the lower and upper houses of Parliament passed the Abolition of the Mandatory Death Penalty Act 2023, thereby abolishing the mandatory death penalty and imprisonment for natural life in Malaysia. Under the leadership of present Chief Justice Tun Tengku Maimun Tuan Mat, we undertook a landmark, the judiciary undertook a landmark sentencing review for some 1,021 individuals on death row and or serving imprisonment for the duration of their natural life in prisons across Malaysia. The said reviews were conducted under the temporary jurisdiction conferred upon the Federal Court, the highest court or the apex court in Malaysia, for this purpose by the revision of sentence of death and imprisonment for natural life temporary jurisdiction of the Federal Court Act 2023. These two legislations form the bedrock of the abolition of the mandatory death penalty in Malaysia in 2023. I had the occasion as Malaysia's Deputy Minister for Law and Institutional Reform at the time in formulating the policies underlying the abolition and review legislations and later tabling both the said bills in Parliament. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share more of the same with the international community here today. As a brief background, in the past, 11 offences carried the mandatory death penalty in Malaysia. This comprised of 9 offences under the Penal Code and 2 offences under the Firearms Increased Penalties Act 1971. Some notable offences of these 11 include murder, committing terrorist act, hostage taking and discharging of a firearm in the commission of an offence. However, what is most interesting and lesser known to many is that our formulation of the Abolition Act did not only abolish the mandatory death penalty, but went further to, firstly, abolish the sentence of imprisonment for the duration of the natural life of a person in 24 offences across 4 legislations, namely the Penal Code, the Firearms Increased Penalties Act 1971, the Arms Act 1960, and the Strategic Trade Act 2010. And what is most interesting is that we also abolish the death penalty entirely for offences that do not cause death. This resulted in the removal of the death penalty in 6 offences where death was not caused across 4 legislations, namely, as I said, the Penal Code, Kidnapping Act 1961, Firearms Increased Penalties Act 1971, and the Arms Act 1960. There were, however, 3 exceptional offences across 2 legislations, the Penal Code and the Dangerous Drugs Act, that were exempted from this broad policy of the removal of the death penalty for offences that do not cause death, owing to the grave nature of these offences. In respect of alternative sentencing to the mandatory death penalty and imprisonment for natural life, the alternative sentences that were prescribed under the new law was for a term of imprisonment of at least 30 years, but not exceeding 40, and of whipping of not less than 12 years in lieu of the death penalty. And of course, for imprisonment, where punishment for imprisonment for natural life was abolished, the alternative punishment imposed was also the same, of not less than 30 years, but not exceeding 40 years. It must be pointed out that of the 1,021 persons who applied, who were on death row in Malaysia, 25 were those whose petitions for clemency had been rejected, and 70 others had their death sentences commuted to natural life. The Abolition of Mandatory Death Penalty Act 2023 was made retrospective in nature, allowing all those who had been sentenced to death or imprisonment for natural life to benefit from the amendments on appeal. Secondly, for the said 1,021 persons who had exhausted the appellate process, the revision of sentence of death and imprisonment for natural life, temporary jurisdiction of the Federal Court, Act 2023 was drafted to confer jurisdiction on the Federal Court to review those death sentences. The review process commenced on the 29th, commenced on the 14th of November 2023 and was completed on the 29th of October 2024 in less than a year. There were a grand total of 55 sittings held by the Federal Court, where 936 applications were filed to review the death sentences, in which 860 applications were allowed. 47 applications to substitute the death penalty with imprisonment were rejected, and the death penalty was maintained in these 47 cases, which mostly involved gruesome murders, including the death or the murders of infants and elderly persons. In addition, there were 120 applications filed to review the sentences for natural life, which were all allowed and substituted with 30 to 40 years. It must be pointed out that in respect of murder, there have been cases where the Federal Court, Court of Appeal, and the High Court have maintained or imposed the death penalty, as I pointed out. Amnesty International recorded a significant reduction in the use of the death penalty by Malaysian courts between the 4th of July 2023 and the 4th of January 2024. In its review of 139 cases during this period, 42 individuals, or 28%, had their charges amended to a lesser offense or were acquitted, either at the High Court or on appeal. Among the remaining 97 cases where accused persons were convicted of a capital offense, 26 or 27% resulted in the death penalty being imposed or upheld, while 71 cases, or 73%, saw alternative punishments applied either at the High Court or through substitution on appeal. In closing, Mr. President, may I say that legal reforms such as the abolition of the mandatory death penalty in Malaysia have increasingly provided judges with the discretion to impose alternative sentences. This shift enables a more individualized approach to justice, ensuring that sentences are proportionate to the crime committed. I believe this increased judicial discretion in sentencing is a step in the right direction towards perhaps a total abolition of the death penalty in the future in Malaysia. Thank you very much.